you.
Hi, and welcome to the podcast. Today I have on the show with me Candice Land. Welcome, Candice.
Welcome. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. Tell us a little bit about yourself. So I know a little bit about you, and we've got connections through the surfing world, but I want to know about your business side of things and what you do with business, as well as prior to that being an athlete.
Ooh la la.
Where do you start?
See my brain just go, what? So yeah, I am, I guess, you know, in Western culture, we tend to always start with our job title. So I'm an accredited exercise physiologist and exercise scientist. Mm-hmm. And funnily enough, I've been in this industry or in that world for a really long time, almost 20 years, which is a little bit mind blowing.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, so at the moment, my current business is the Female Surfer, but I've been working as a clinical exercise physiologist and working in rehab and musculoskeletal rehab and athlete performance for like a really long time. But I've really honed in on gender-specific rehab and athlete performance over probably the last 7 years. And that came about from just working at contests and events primarily, and just seeing the fluctuations in athletes according to kind of different events. And just seeing the differences in how female athletes needed to handle competition pressure versus male athletes, and where the two would kind of go. So yeah, that kind of started my journey more into the gender specific training, which is what I kind of specialize in now.
Yeah, so that niche narrowed it down,
yeah. And which is funny because I probably should have known as an athlete. It's really interesting. I sometimes look back and go, why didn't the light bulb come on then? But I think because I was in so much of our development as female athletes is in like a very male dominated sporting arena. I had very little access to female coaches and female mentors. And so, and kind of even when I went to uni, it was the same sort of thing. So yeah, it's really interesting that it's only now as I reflect back on my performance as an athlete that I go, wow, like I wish I'd known then kind of what I know now, and I probably would have pulled back with less injuries. I would have had more longevity. I would have been able to handle competition pressure better because my background as an athlete was in martial arts, so it was a contact sport, and really kind of confronting and really challenging to manage that anaerobic power and that explosiveness premenstrually. So yeah, it was an interesting journey. Yeah.
So where did the jump to surfing come into it then? Have you surfed all your life? Or
No. So here's a bit of a background. I actually grew up in the tropics in far north Queensland. So I did pretty much every sport other than surfing. But when I was in my mid-20s, I moved to Ireland for a little while and wanted to do something completely different. And I heard the beaches were really nice and that you could surf at some of these beaches. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to give it a crack. And I ended up actually moving in with the locals that ran the surf school there. And that's how I got into surfing.
And when was that?
Oh, good golly. I was 25. So I think I was around 25. So yeah, 15 years ago. How old am I now? 15, 20 years ago. That's mental.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. Sometime around then.
I'll tell you a little bit about how I got into surfing and when I got into surfing. So mine was, I've been an corrective exercise coach or personal trainer and CHEK practitioner for 18 years now. Always loved surfing. Grew up in Canberra. Used to go down to the coast, Tathra Beach every summer. Would sit on the beach, not getting in the water. And I also have a fear of fish in the water, fear of fish biting me, not sharks, it's just fish. So I didn't get in the water. My family, like my brother surfed, but my family water skied, and I still wouldn't really get into the river much. I was one of the only people my dad could not teach how to water ski. But loved surfing and loved following it. So I moved down to Melbourne from the Gold Coast where I lived for 6 years. I moved down to Melbourne 23 years ago now. Started going to Bells every year, watching the surfing, but didn't actually start to learn to surf until I got the job at Urban Surf 2.5, 3 years ago. So most of my surfing experience is pool-based.
Interesting.
But the clinical background. So I worked with like standard across the board, people wanting to lose weight, people wanting to tone up. And with the CHEK background, always got people with back injuries and core conditioning, particularly women. but always had in the back of my mind that I wanted to work with high-end professional surfing athletes, but didn't see where I could take that path or where I could get into that, because I live here in Melbourne in the city, not close to the beach, and didn't really see an opportunity until Urban Surf opened. And I went, okay, this is my in. I've got to learn how to surf and I've got to learn how to swim, because I didn't learn how to swim until then either. So yeah, I find there's a lot of people, particularly women, who are getting into our sport. And now we know for a fact during COVID, it's one of the biggest uptakes of any sport in the world is women in surfing in the last 2 years or so. But so many people coming into it at that, what we would call a more mature age.
The fastest growing age group, I think, is 30 to 45 years of age.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting time when you think about
life cycles
and lifestyle wise, what's happening in a female's life as well. Yeah. And then, like you still have quite a high entry level, that 45 to 55-year-old age group as well. So, when suddenly they have more time for themselves, they're no longer sitting on the beach watching their husband in the surf, they get the chance to kind of give it a go themselves. So it is an interesting journey. And also I've been talking to, and you might find this as well, but I've been talking to some of the surf coaches locally, like, do you know Belen Fuller?
Heard of, yep.
Yeah. And she's got this nice little project that she's starting. But it's interesting the number of women who start surfing that don't have the physical conditioning to commence surfing, and how much that plays into their journey and their experiences as they learn to surf. So it's something that we've been chatting about a lot. Yeah.
I put this post up on my Instagram a couple of days ago. What is one thing that you want to improve in your surfing? And what keeps coming back to me continually is to get over my fear of surfing, or fear of bigger waves, or fear of being out there in the ocean. And so it's a physiological thing that physically, oftentimes we come into a sport like this with other things that we've carried from earlier in our life, injuries or emotional trauma that we hold in our tissue that disables us from being able to move our hips and pelvic area. But also there's still a fear factor around it.
Oh yeah, for sure. And it's really interesting. So over the last 6 months, I think since like November, December last year, I got involved with the Her Wave initiative through Surfing New South Wales. And that enabled me to run workshops all up and down the east coast of Australia for 6 months and start to really accumulate stories and experiences from female surfers. I've posted about this a little bit on my social media. And I've also run off the back of that a survey to the general female surfing community as well. And that's created some really interesting, I guess it's outlined some really interesting information around that fear factor and some of the factors that might actually kind of be involved in that. I think it can be tied back to also a lack of physical conditioning. I think that the fitter you are, the more confident you feel in the water. Totally. And when I've spoken to, because Chelsea Hedges and I have had lots of conversations about this, and I often talk to some of the local girls around here about how when the big swell comes and how they handle it. And one of the things that Chelsea Hedges has said is that swim training and maintaining her fitness was like one of the biggest factors in her feeling comfortable in bigger surf. She knew that she had the fitness to be able to handle it. She had the paddle capacity to be able to get herself out of dangerous situations. She had the duck dive capacity from the upper body strength to get herself out of, to get herself under, big waves. Yep. But she knew that if her leg rope snapped, if anything happened, she had the capacity to swim herself back to shore. And to this day, I still see her going up into the ocean with fins. So it's interesting that in the realm where breath training and all of that is so popular in terms of enhancing confidence in the ocean, and it definitely has a massive element in that, and performance as well. I find that as a female's physical condition improves and her level of fitness improves, so does systemically her sense of confidence in the water. And that's something that I've just found watching a female's journey as she progresses with her conditioning.
It's almost a missing link, isn't it? You've got to have those two.
They go hand in hand. Yeah. It's like, when you haven't been in the surf for a little while and you start paddling and you feel really unfit.
Slow.
That paddle fitness, and it instantly makes you feel unconfident in the water because you're like, oh my God, I'm gassed already. Like, how am I meant to get out there? And I think it's important, and I ask women as well to understand whether their fear has a cyclical nature or not. Women have this, the way that we utilize our brain is very different to a male. And the way that we assess threat and access information is really quite different. So we kind of already have this capacity for hypervigilance, which can be really beneficial. But if it's heightened or too all-consuming, it can be a little bit challenging and impact our performance.
Yeah.
Exactly. And also whether it's cyclical. So there's a couple of things that change during a menstrual cycle phase that can also increase that sense of fear and overwhelm in the water. So just having some strategies in place around that. So you've got your physical conditioning and fitness, but then also strategies to narrow your focus. So having a focus tool in place, which you might find as well with your surf coaching.
Yeah.
One thing. Talk about this in my blog. Yeah, one thing. Yeah. Focus on one thing. Take the overwhelm away from, oh my gosh, I'm surfing. There's so many people out here. I'm going to look like
who's looking at me?
Beginner. I'm not confident. I'm feeling, this. I'm feeling that. And we really attach a lot of feeling to sports participation. That's another thing as well, which can drive like anxiety profiles and things. But then also recognize that you may have a sensitivity to anxiety at different phases of your menstrual cycle and different phases of your lifespan. So if you're starting to learn how to surf when you're perimenopausal, that could be, your fear could be coming down to your physiology, and you can use that knowledge to develop tools to support your journey. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Definitely. I want to go back to one of the things that you mentioned there, because it's a really interesting factor. Female's brain is different to a male's brain in terms of how we interpret danger.
Yeah.
And I know that in terms of when we talk, within my coaching, I talk about archetypes and how we fall into different roles that we play in life. And we talk about archetypes being a coat that you wear. So mother archetype for females, whether you're a mother physically or not, is a very strong archetype, because we've got that feminine energy and we want to mother. Do you think that fear factor and that difference in our brain versus a male's brain is something that contributes to that fear going up at certain times in the cycle?
Yes, because it's more of a prolific accumulation of information in terms of what's going on in the environment. So a male's brain is quite good at just tracking towards the frontal lobe and back, and that's kind of how it assesses information. And that gives them capacity. They've got a clearer sense of direction. They're less likely to experience a sense of overwhelm. They have different relationships with fear, those sorts of things. For a woman, because the way that I guess you could argue that it's in our design, obviously, to assess risk as mothers and as carers. And, our role is to, keep our family safe.
Yeah. And reproduce life. Yeah.
And reproduce life. Exactly. Yeah. So we tend to pull a lot of information from different aspects and different components of the brain. So from a neurological perspective, that's a quite dense neurological load. So that it can be a little bit overwhelming, even if you're thinking in terms of like the sensory load on the brain as well. And
the limbic system.
Yep. All that stuff as well. Yeah. So, and also if you do, for example, have an anxiety sensitivity that increases premenstrually, then that whole system kind of just can really kind of wind up.
Regulate. Yeah.
Yeah.
So who are the majority of the people that you work with at the moment?
Oh, I work with the whole spectrum. I'm really lucky. And this is what I love so much about actually the way that, the experience that I've been able to have. It's really great because I get to have a really broad spectrum overview of information, which I love because it enables me to see where the holes are. And I go, oh, that's still missing, and oh, that's still missing, and oh, that's still missing. So I work with junior athletes all the way through to CT level athletes, and I've been fortunate enough to work with some of the best surfers in the world. And also, your weekend warriors to your absolute beginners and kind of everything in between. And I do work with both genders as well. I don't just solely work with females. So yeah, the whole broad spectrum is where I sit.
So are you clinically based with them, or are you doing surf coaching like out on the beach with them as well?
No, so I'm predominantly clinical based or in the gym, or I work with them online. Yeah.
Cool.
So we have my spectrum, or my sphere of knowledge in terms of like on the beach, is to actually just technically watch what's going on and understand it from a biomechanical point of view. And that, that's how I would undertake a video analysis on the beach or something like that. It would be like, okay, I'm having this technical problem. Cool, I'll come and watch you at the beach, or I'll come and film you at the beach, and then we'll break it down and go, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense why that might be happening.
Yeah, tight oblique. Something's not happening. Something's not activating properly.
You can't. There's something going on here with your head rotation that's not enabling whatever it might be. Yeah.
Very cool and so much fun. That's the perspective that I come from, as well as being in the water with them surf coaching at the level that I'm at Urban Surf at the moment, because I'm doing Learn to Surf beginner 1, beginner 2. Hoping to jump up into cruiser intermediate in summer, but I have to pull myself back from talking technically to people when I get people like Learn to Surfers, because like you said, you have to focus on one thing, and oftentimes that's just understanding the surfboard before they even get in the water, before I start to bring in, and I am able to do that a whole lot more now with our 5-week programs, because I'm seeing people on a continuing basis. But yeah, for me, I've had to tone it down and stop talking as technically or anatomically, because that's not what people need at the level that I'm coaching them in the water. Outside the water, land-based stuff, I'm certainly doing that, but not inside the water.
I think there is a real beauty to that, to be able to put space around things. Remember before we were talking about white space, and when you have this fascination with the human body and how it works, you just want to dig deep, like go there kind of straight away. There is, and you'll know, and it's so funny how often lessons in life link back to movement. When you're encouraging someone to move well, sometimes the unlocking piece for that human being is to just go where the greatest sense of ease is, and to actually not try very hard at all. Like go where the space kind of is. Sometimes I feel like, in terms of instruction and verbal communication with athletes, it's like, just keep it simple and keep space around it. Give them the opportunity to kind of just be there
and absorb what you're saying in the first place, rather than overload it too much. So what do you think is the biggest thing that's overlooked, or the often overlooked factors that should be considered when it comes to coaching females?
Oh, yes.
Or from the athlete's perspective, like what is the most common thing that's the missing thing that you see from the people that you coach?
So it's interesting, because this at an athlete level, so if I'm on a CT event or a QS event, love to discuss with athletes what they're currently including in their training. And I see basically how their bodies are moving and what's uncoupling and what's kind of going on. And it's really interesting how what I see with beginner to intermediate athletes, some of that is still missing in highly competitive athletes, right?
Yeah.
The latest thing that I'm finding or seeing is actually not gender specific.
Wow.
I see it in both male and females, and it's the ability to, it's core stability and returning to good core function, which often requires postural decompression. That type of terminology probably makes a lot more sense to you.
Absolutely. But break it down a bit,
Yeah. So surfing involves a lot of paddling. So about 50% of a surf session is paddling. And so what we find is the actual tasks that are involved in surfing over time contribute to these certain postures that you get. So for example, paddling will lift your rib cage and tilt your pelvis forward, and then you kind of dump into the lumbar spine and dump into the neck, and over time you lose this postural awareness around lumbar pelvis stability, for example. It's just one kind of example.
Being on your belly like that, you don't have to activate your core.
That's right. And then you come up into a sitting posture, or for you and me, like if we go for a surf and then we come back and work at our desk, and quite often you just dump back into the lumbar spine, but in a C-based posture. And for athletes, they do that as well when they're traveling. So you kind of lose this sensitivity around the stability around the lumbar spine and the pelvis. And in both of those positions, it's not an optimal, you're not going to get optimal core stability naturally or intrinsically. The one the core stability that works with the pelvic floor and the diaphragm, and how it's all meant to intrinsically work naturally and stabilize your spine and distribute load and all those beautiful things. So it's really interesting that the sport itself over time drives you away from good function. Mm-hmm. You don't know how to pull back into, if you don't know how to
return to the stable position.
Yes. And pull yourself away from those sorts of postures.
Yeah. It's an interesting conundrum as a coach, because we're trying to enhance or bring out the best performance in the athlete without changing what makes them a good athlete in the first place, but doesn't compromise their health in the process. So it's this balance of, is it functional? And that's a very overused term, I think, especially in the last 10 years. But it is true in this position, like in this statement. What's functional for them to win titles and win surfing competitions, you have to train them to be the best in that position, but it might not be functional outside the water. But how much does it compromise their ability to unwind those positions outside the water? Because they're going to spend a lot of time in their professional life in those positions, and it needs to be performance based so that they earn money and win.
And they need to train their tolerance for that, and they do. So at the moment I'm doing the Surf Aid Challenge with Chelsea Hedges is on our team, and obviously as a world champion surfer, she's had a lot of paddle experience, right? So elite athletes have this real efficiency with what they do. It doesn't mean that they're not going to throw themselves over their threshold, because there's certain variables that will kind of throw them over that. So I always look at it from that threshold perspective. You've got to be able to train that tolerance for that sort of activity, but you want to give them a chance to pull away from that threshold, because away from the threshold is where you get recovery. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So you get
how much dysfunction they're training into versus how much they pull out of.
It's like me being a martial artist. If I kick a kick bag all day, every day, and then I don't give myself the chance to stretch and move and mobilize my hips and return to stability, over time, I'm not going to be able to kick as well for as long, as powerfully, without giving myself a very, very, very sore hip. So, you train your capacities, but part of training the capacity is giving yourself a chance to recover. And then concurrently, if you can come back to efficiency as part of your recovery, and that's what I was talking about returning to core and decompressing yourself from paddle postures, for example. If you can bring yourself back from that threshold, you give yourself the opportunity to move back into a more efficient movement pattern, and then you handle those loads a lot better.
Yeah. And do you find it difficult to have athletes understand that their longevity in the sport is going to be compromised if they don't do that pulling back and decompressing?
I think that's changing. I think they're really starting to understand, because you know what it feels like when your body's working really well and kind of when it's not. I do think that there is still a culture within the conditioning world, and this will bring me back to what I was talking about before around space, but there is still a culture within the conditioning world that load heavy, load hard, and load fast, and the intention of like working harder is better kind of thing. So there's still that kind of cultural, and I've struggled with this as a professional myself, because I know that load leads to adaptation, and I know that. But where I have seen some of the most powerful change happen in the body is when somebody is able to access something within a state of ease. When I just say to them, I want you to do this, as light as a feather, and they just go boom. And suddenly, you know, when they're not under compression, when they're not under load, when they get the chance to do something as light as a feather, it just unlocks something for them, and suddenly they've got this improvement in capacity and a better capacity to handle load. So does that answer your question?
It does, absolutely.
So
yep. So that's one of the most common things that you're seeing at the moment, is that inability to deload and decompress, but core activation.
Yeah. And look, stretching and all that sort of stuff will do it to a certain level. Yes, but having that capacity, and the two go hand in hand. If you can come back to improving your postural alignment, you will come back into your core a lot better naturally. Yeah. But we sit up here all the time in terms of the nervous system is really stimulated. The respiratory system is really stimulated. So we've got this upper respiratory pattern. So we have this, and women in particular, again, it comes down to how we assess stress and where we are at in terms of our hormone profile or our hormone cycle. You know, we sit up here all the time. And so having the ability to kind of pull back into the body and shift back and shift away from that and come back to the center is really important.
So then I'm going to ask you, we talk about work versus workout in the CHEK program.
Yeah.
So working out being the harder physical, expressing that stress, and that is stress. How do you coach someone in being back on the work inside of things, and getting them to understand how important that rest time or downtime or low load days are?
Yes. I just highlight to them that recovery is where the change happens. It's not when you're in a high stress state, be that induced by the environment or some external stressor, or whether the stress is induced by exercise. That's not, when you're sitting there, that's not where your training adaptation happens. It happens when you're in rest and recovery. So if you're not giving yourself the chance to get back to that point, you're not going to get the adaptation that you're actually training for. You're going to drive yourself into overtraining and fatigue and overuse.
Injury.
Yeah. The other thing that I explain to them is that from a motor control perspective, you want to have, it's great to have the strategies that are high volume. So high load, explosive training, loud to the sensory system, go. But in terms of being adaptable, in terms of being able to have movement strategies, a variety of movement strategies that are adaptable to the environment and what's happening around you, which is particularly important with surfers with different changing surf conditions, and each contest is like a different wave, and you've got
different wave. Different,
yeah.
Yep.
You have to have have to have the whole spectrum of I call it sound, but it's like the sensitivity. You have to be able to do the whole spectrum of movement. You have to be able to, high volume, high noise to the nervous system strategies are good. That's load and all that sort of stuff. But your body also needs to be able to be adaptable at the low load strategies as well. So an adaptable athlete is one that can turn the volume, that can turn the volume up and turn the volume down and be able to stabilize and be good across that whole spectrum.
Who do you think at the moment on the CT is the best example of that? Knowing that Steph won her 8th title today. Go, Steph.
It's so hard to say. It's really, really hard to say, because there's so many things that, there are so many factors that come into play on contest day.
Yeah.
So, Carissa might have had it all together all year, but then something else has happened leading up to that contest, and suddenly her strategies just aren't working anymore. Not to say that that's actually what's happened by any means, but
as an example of,
just an example. So it's really hard to say who's doing it best. I just think that they're really smart and really switched on.
More so than 20 years ago.
Yeah, they're just hungry they're just open-minded and hungry for information. I find surfers in general are really kind of open-minded to information, almost too open-minded, that they'll take anybody's information, and then that in itself becomes a problem. But they're really switched on, like they're athletes. Yeah.
From the few athletes that I've worked with, one of the things that I see happening is that they take on lots of different information from different coaches and different training programs, and one of my beefs is that people will, and this is not just athletes as well, but general population will do this, will jump into an online program, which is all well and good if they know their body really well, but then they follow the one thing because everybody else is doing it and not get individually assessed. And so if you had someone who was wanting to be a professional surfer, what would you say the things that they need? And I know this is a massive thing that I've had with people as well, is the lack of money. They feel like they can't afford things because there's a lack of money and they're not earning money on the tour and someone else is paying for them to be there. And there's a whole network of stuff that goes along emotionally with that. But if you were going to set somebody up, someone who's up and coming, what would you recommend for them in terms of where they spend their money to be the best professional athlete they can be and to give them the best chance at that? Okay.
So here's the avatar that I'm thinking of in particular for that question. I'm visualizing a 13-year-old female surfer. She's done really well with all the junior competitions, but she's at that point where she's like, I think I have a chance at this, so I'm going to go for it. And that's generally the age where it is kind of make or break for athletes. So if you want to be on the CT, you're kind of setting yourself up from that age.
From 13.
Oh, easily, if not before. And that's a really critical time because you're growing. And for women, like you're going to, well, for both genders, you're going to hit puberty around that time. So there's all sorts of
hormonal fluctuations.
Yeah, around that time. You've just got to get the basics right. It doesn't have to be overcomplicated. And you have to be able to self-care. Like, do it smart. So one of the biggest, I always do a nutritional screening, particularly with female athletes. Not that I'm a nutritionist and I won't go into micronutrients or anything like that, but I just want to have a look at what their food consumption is like, because obviously I want to make sure that they're not putting themselves at any sort of health risk. So I will always make sure that they've got really good nutrition and really good hydration. I want to be looking at things like their self-care around sleep and how that's going. I want to be looking at things like their environment, how they're handling stress. These are all big picture things, low-lying fruit that if you get that right, it's going to make everything else easier. You're going to be able to train better. You're going to be able to recover better. You're going to be able to handle stress of competition better. So just get the basics right. And I would also say, in terms of like strength and conditioning training or surf conditioning, same deal. Get the foundations right. You want longevity in this sport. And if you want to be able to, if you want to be able to minimize your risk of injury over time and you want to be able to improve your longevity in sport, you kind of got to get the basics right. So you want to be making sure that you've got the framework right, that you've got stability where you need stability and mobility where you need mobility, and you've got this tolerance to be able to handle the more explosive loads and the vestibular system and all that sort of stuff. So
yeah. And the physical movements of where surfing's going now, because we know it's going aerial.
Yeah, that's right. And you know what is fundamentally missing all the time is just that axial skeletal stability. It's just the stability between your head down to your pubic bone. And coming back to that, if you've got that down pat, holy dooly, then that opens up a lot of things.
So if we're talking about 13 and younger being the age where we now need to start doing this, are you talking to parents about that sort of thing when you are coaching people?
Yeah, I did the one of my first surfing, not one of my first surfing events. I was really fortunate. The way that I kind of entered into the contest world was I was working with a couple of QS athletes and then did some training with the World Surf League medical team, and then got asked to work on a CT event. And from that event, I was like, holy dooly, like this is really amazing. This is how these athletes are moving. This is what's happening with the body. That's really fascinating. They get access to some incredible information because there are some hands down mind-blowing practitioners that work with the World Surf League, like
through the DNS network. Yep.
Oh yeah, and not even necessarily through the DNS. They're just exceptional. It's just honestly, their knowledge blows my mind. So I was really interested then to know, okay, well, how far down is this information filtering? Like how like at what age and at what competition level are people getting access to this information? Because there's a lot of pressure on junior athletes to make it, kind of thing. So I started doing the Oki Grom Pro was one of my first junior events. So I started, working with the junior Groms because I just wanted to see, where the gaps were and how much information they were getting, because they train a lot. They still do. I remember, in part of my screening protocols with the athletes at events, junior athletes, I was always asking them how much surfing, how many hours of surfing you're doing a week. And they're still doing 15 to 20 hours of surfing a week. That's a lot.
That's a lot.
Yeah. So what was the original question? Sorry.
So do you speak to the parents, like who's getting the information and where it's going to?
So yes. So at that event and working with junior athletes at event, there's been heaps more interest. And I think now that it's an Olympic sport and there's like this normalization of training and this normalization of exercise, land-based exercise conditioning in conjunction. And I was working with a junior athlete who the actual state governing body suggested to her, you need to be doing land-based training as well. So it's kind of become a norm. So it's, when I first started doing the Oki Grom Pro, I remember parents were like, what, this is ridiculous. Some parents, not all parents, some parents were like, this is ridiculous. Like, what are you doing? You just surf. Like, that's what you need to do.
That's what
But now it's definitely changing. So and parents want to do, the right thing by their kids in general. So definitely do a lot of chatting to parents. They're involved in the surf screening. So I get the ability to educate both parent and child as we kind of go along on the journey. So it's a big learning process.
Yeah, I think that's part of being a good coach, is knowing that we're learning along the way as well. That, like you said, you're looking for the gaps in the market and looking and trying to find who knows what sort of information so that you can learn and so that you can help bring that forward.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just takes one person who isn't in the box in terms of typical patterning or anything like that, where you just go, whoa, like I've just learned something so new due to that individual. You're constantly learning and evolving always.
What are you excited about for in the near future, with summer coming up now and competitions ramping up here in Australia for the QS for next year, as well as QS starting for this year? What are you looking forward to most? Big question. One of our last questions.
I don't really know the answer to that question, because I'm kind of with everything that I've got going on in life and in my business. I'm just kind of going month by month by month.
Are you doing her wave again next year?
I'm not sure what's going on with her wave. I'm not sure what's happening in terms of funding and whether that's going to run the same way that it did last year. That was an incredible incentive. If that happened again, I'd be super stoked to kind of get on board. I really enjoyed because I live in a little bubble here, because I live in northern New South Wales, so really close to the Gold Coast. So if you're in the surfing industry, you live in this little bubble where there's access to heaps of things. But when you go down to the south coast of New South Wales, like Maroondah, for example, like
forgotten.
So I really enjoyed going down there and catching up with them and sharing stories. So I would personally love to do more board riders stuff and linking with some board riders clubs. I love working on contests. I love the vibe. It's something really different because you've got this 20-minute window to work with somebody and really make a difference. So, you've got to be really switched on and clear in the head and like ready to go and make big change really, really quickly. So it's high vibe, high energy. So and in some ways I'm looking forward to kind of solidifying what I'm currently doing. I really want to get all my online programs and everything down pat. And get them kind of just rolling over and being able to tweak them as I go along. I've got another one that I'm kind of working on at the moment. So that's kind of where I'm focusing on. Summer. Oh my gosh, we're in spring.
Yes, we are. August. Well, we're in September. Are you looking forward to the Olympics being in Australia, and do you think that's going to be a massive boost to our industry?
Huge. Yeah, without a doubt. You just see where money is being invested in the institutes of sport right now. and the research that they're starting to look into as well. Because obviously I keep an eye on female specific research projects and what's happening in the industry, and there's a lot of investment going on in that right now. Huge.
That's awesome.
So it's big growth now. Yeah, for sure. And it was so well showcased in Japan.
Yeah.
And I think our Australian athletes in particular were really, all the surfing athletes really represented their countries really well. I just think it was really well represented at the Olympics, and hats off to them. If I was somebody investing in in future research projects and I had nothing to do with the surfing industry, just based off that alone, I'd be happy to throw money at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. There's another topic that I wanted to talk to you about, which I probably will ask if you'll be a guest again for me, and that's how women and having children in the surfing industry, what that looks like. But that's a whole nother topic for a whole nother day. So,
and there's a few spheres involved in that. You can never separate the biology from the psychology from the social environment. So there's a few spheres involved in that.
So thank you very much for being with me today, Candice. That was really good.
I hope that the information is useful to your listeners.
Absolutely. Where can people find you if they want to get in contact?
Thefemalesurfer.com is the easiest way. And on Instagram, it's at the female surfer. Those are the two main platforms I operate off. I'm not really all that good on Facebook. I've got heaps of cool stuff and heaps of I call it consumer driven information. So I really try with all my blog content and things like that to make sure that it's consumer driven. It's information that people are actually asking for. So
absolutely.
If they just want to go on there and have a read of some blogs and then reach out to me, that's perfect.
So shoot you a question in the DMs.
Shoot me a question in the DMs, or send me an email, easy as.
Awesome. Thank you very much for being with me today, Candice.
You.